The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie silver glow over the small village of Belford. The villagers, weary and haunted by recent events, shuttered their windows and locked their doors tightly. Whispers of monstrous howls and shadowy figures prowling the night had spread fear like a plague. In the center of the village stood a modest cottage, its walls thick with the scent of burning herbs, a desperate attempt to ward off the evil lurking outside. Inside the cottage, Gawain stood on the doorstep, dressed in short pants, his head uncovered. His eyes were wide with terror, his body rigid, as if rooted to the spot. On the mat at his feet lay Voin, his back turned to Gawain, his shaved head glistening in the dim light of a lamp on the ground. The lamp burned feebly, casting long, wavering shadows that danced ominously across the room. Gawain dared not move, holding his breath as he stared at Voin. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second an eternity. Voin hesitated, then bent down, passing under the hammocks with a slow, deliberate grace. He seemed to fold into himself, his movements fluid and unnatural. The whole scene played out in a matter of seconds, yet it felt like an eternity to Gawain. Morning broke with a reluctant dawn, the sky a muted gray. Gawain, his mind racing with questions, approached Voin, who was now awake and sitting up. "You didn't go out last night?" Gawain's voice trembled as he spoke. "I went out," Voin replied calmly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "How did you get out?" Gawain's voice wavered with confusion and fear. "You've been asleep all this time." "I was asleep," Voin repeated, his smile widening, though it did nothing to ease Gawain's unease. "I needed to know something, and while my body was gaining strength in my sleep, I ran around the village like a rat. I found out everything I wanted and came back here." Gawain shivered. Voin's calm demeanor, his cryptic words, and that unsettling smile hinted at something far more sinister. There were stories in Belford, old tales of people who could transform into beasts, losing their humanity under the full moon. Gawain had always dismissed them as superstitions, but now, looking into Voin's eyes, he wasn't so sure. Voin stood and stretched, his movements languid, almost feline. "You should get some rest, Voin. The nights are long, and the moon is not yet done with us." As Voin turned away, Gawain felt a chill run down his spine. There was something deeply wrong with Voin, something that made his skin crawl. He could not shake the feeling that Voin was hiding a dark secret, one that might explain the recent terror gripping the village. The following night, the moon was even fuller, its glow more intense, casting the village in a ghostly light. Gawain, unable to sleep, sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the door. Hours passed, and the silence of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a wolf. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, Gawain saw Voin rise from his mat. His movements were slow, deliberate. He walked to the door, and with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, he slipped out into the night. Gawain, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, followed. Voin moved through the village with eerie silence, his bare feet making no sound on the cobblestone streets. Gawain kept his distance, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the edge of the village, where the forest loomed dark and foreboding. Voin disappeared into the shadows, and Gawain, despite every instinct telling him to turn back, pressed on. The forest was alive with the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But beneath it all, Gawain could hear something else, something low and guttural, a growl. He crept forward, peering through the dense underbrush. In a small clearing bathed in moonlight, he saw Voin. But it was not the Voin he knew. His body was contorting, bones cracking, muscles bulging. His skin seemed to ripple and shift, sprouting from every pore. His face elongated, transforming into a snout filled with sharp teeth. His eyes, once human, now glowed with a feral hunger. Voin gasped, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrifying transformation. Voin was no longer a man, but a werewolf, a creature of nightmare. The beast sniffed the air, its ears twitching. Gawain's blood ran cold as those glowing eyes locked onto his. With a primal roar, the werewolf charged. Gawain turned and ran, the forest a blur around him. He could hear the beast behind him, its heavy breathing, its claws tearing through the underbrush. Panic surged through him, giving him speed, but he knew he couldn't outrun it forever. He burst out of the forest, back into the village. He could see the lights of his cottage ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind him. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Outside, the werewolf howled, a sound that echoed through the night, filling the village with dread. Vuen knew he had to warn the others, but as he struggled to his feet, he realized the horrifying truth. Vuen had found out everything he wanted, and now the village of Belford was doomed. Vuen's eyes flicked through the window. The moonlight cast long shadows on the floor, and among them, he saw movement. Slowly, he turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Vuen, his eyes glowing with that same feral hunger. "You see, Vuen said, his voice a guttural growl. "Some transformations happen intentionally, but others are inevitable." Vuen's scream echoed through the night, swallowed by the darkness and the howl of the beast outside. Vuen's scream faded into the oppressive silence of the night. Vuen's eyes glinted with a malevolent gleam, and his lips curled into a wicked smile, revealing sharp teeth still half hidden by human gums. The transformation had stopped midway, leaving Vuen in a grotesque state, half man, half beast. "There's nowhere to run, Vuen growled, his voice a guttural mix of human speech and animalistic snarls. "The village is mine now." Vuen, his heart pounding like a war drum, backed away slowly. His mind raced, searching for any means of escape or defense. His eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy iron poker by the fireplace. Summoning every ounce of courage, he lunged for it. Vuen's eyes narrowed, and in a flash, he leapt forward. But Vuen was quicker, grabbing the poker and swinging it with all his might. The iron connected with Vuen's shoulder, and he let out a roar of pain and rage. Stumbling back, Vuen glared at Vuen, a mixture of fury and grudging respect in his eyes. "You think you can fight me?" Vuen snarled, his body trembling as the transformation threatened to complete itself. "You're a fool." Vuen didn't reply. He gripped the poker tightly, his knuckles white. He knew he couldn't defeat Vuen in a straight fight, but he had to do anything to protect the village and buy time. With a sudden, desperate move, Vuen dashed out the door, hoping to lead Vuen away from the village. The night air was cold and biting, but Vuen barely felt it as he sprinted towards the forest, the sound of Vuen's pursuit close behind. The forest was a maze of shadows and unseen dangers. Vuen plunged into its depths, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear Vuen crashing through the underbrush, a relentless predator on the hunt. Branches whipped at Vuen's face, but he didn't slow down, pushing deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, Vuen stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in strange symbols and surrounded by flickering torches. It was a place of old magic, a relic from a time when the villagers worshipped the forest spirits. Desperation drove Vuen to the altar. He placed the poker on the stone and knelt, his mind racing. He had heard stories of the altar's power, of how it could summon the spirits of the forest to aid those in need. With no other option, he began to chant the old incantations he barely remembered from childhood tales. The air grew thick with energy, the torches flaring brighter. Vuen's voice rose in a plea to the spirits, begging for their aid against the monstrous force threatening his home. As his chant reached a fever pitch, the ground trembled, and a deep, resonant hum filled the clearing. Vuen burst into the clearing, his eyes blazing with fury. "What are you doing, Vuen?" he roared, his voice more beast than man. Before Vuen could answer, a blinding light erupted from the altar. The ground split open, and spectral figures rose from the earth, their forms shimmering and ethereal. They surrounded Vuen, their eyes glowing with ancient power. The spirits moved as one, their voices echoing with a haunting melody. Vuen howled in rage and pain, his body writhing as the spirits' energy enveloped him. Vuen watched in awe and terror, hoping against hope that the spirits would save them. But as the spirits battled Vuen felt a cold dread settle in his heart. The spirits were powerful, but Vuen's transformation was almost complete. With a final, earth-shattering roar, Vuen's body convulsed, and the spirits were thrown back, their energy dissipating. Vuen stood in the center of the clearing, fully transformed into a monstrous werewolf. His eyes, now completely animal, locked onto Vuen with a predatory intensity. "You cannot stop me," he growled, his voice a deep, menacing rumble. "I am unstoppable." As Vuen advanced, Vuen's mind raced. The spirits had failed, and he was out of options. But then, a thought struck him, a desperate, reckless idea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of silver powder, a relic from his grandmother's collection of protective charms. With a prayer to the old gods, Voin flung the silver powder into the air. The fine dust glittered in the moonlight, forming a shimmering cloud between him and Voin. The werewolf hesitated, his eyes narrowing as the silver dust settled on his fur. Voin let out a roar of agony as the silver burned his flesh. He clawed at the air, trying to rid himself of the painful substance. Voin seized the moment, grabbing the poker and driving it into Voin's chest with all his strength. The werewolf's roar turned into a strangled gasp. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and fury. For a moment, it seemed as if the beast would overcome even this mortal wound. But then, with a final, guttural snarl, Voin collapsed, the life draining from his monstrous form. Voin stood over the fallen beast, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was silent, the spirits having retreated to their realm. The village was safe for now. But as Voin stared at Voin's lifeless body, a chilling realization settled over him. Voin had been just the beginning. The curse of the werewolves was ancient and powerful, and there were others out there, waiting, watching. He knew that this night was just a prelude to a greater darkness. The village of Belford had been spared, but the threat was far from over. The werewolves would return, and next time, they would be stronger, more relentless. Voin swore an oath then and there. He would not let the village fall. He would find a way to end the curse once and for all, to protect his home and his people. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Voin knew that the fight for Belford's soul was far from over. The werewolves were out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. Voin stood over Voin's lifeless body, his breath still ragged from the exertion of the fight. The silver dust settled slowly to the ground, sparkling faintly in the moonlight. The forest was eerily silent, the spirits having retreated to their ancient slumber. He glanced around, half expecting another attack, but the forest remained still. The village of Belford seemed safe, at least for the moment. His victory felt hollow. The threat wasn't over. The werewolf curse was ancient and pervasive. He knew he needed to warn the village, to prepare them for the inevitable return of the beasts. But as he turned to make his way back, a chilling realization struck him. He was alone in the dark forest, miles away from help, with dawn still hours away. The eerie silence was broken by a faint rustling in the bushes behind him. Voin spun around, gripping the iron poker tightly, his eyes scanning the shadows. From the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes emerged, followed by another and another. His heart sank. There were more of them. The pack of werewolves stepped into the clearing, their eyes fixed on Voin with predatory hunger. They were larger than Voin had been, their fur darker and their teeth sharper. They moved with a terrifying grace, encircling him, cutting off any chance of escape. Desperation surged through Voin. He brandished the poker, hoping to keep them at bay, but he knew it was futile. The lead werewolf, a massive creature with a scar running down its snout, stepped forward and growled, a low, rumbling sound that sent chills down Voin's spine. "Stay back," Voin shouted, his voice trembling. The werewolves didn't falter. The scarred leader lunged, and Voin swung the poker wildly. It connected with the beast's head, but the werewolf barely flinched. It snarled and knocked Voin to the ground with a powerful swipe of its paw. Pain shot through Voin's body as he hit the ground. The poker slipped from his grasp, landing just out of reach. He scrambled to grab it, but the werewolf was faster. It pounced, pinning him to the ground, its hot breath on his face, its fangs inches from his throat. In the moonlight, Voin could see the intelligence in the werewolf's eyes, a malevolent cunning that sent a wave of terror through him. The beast opened its jaws, preparing to deliver the fatal bite. Voin closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of the sharp pain of fangs sinking into his flesh, he heard a strangled yelp. He opened his eyes to see the werewolf's body shuddering violently. It collapsed on top of him, its eyes glazing over in death. Standing behind it was a figure cloaked in shadow, wielding a silver-tipped spear. The figure pushed the dead werewolf aside and helped Voin to his feet. As they stepped into the moonlight, Voin saw that it was a woman, her face marked with the same ancient symbols as those on the altar. Her eyes were fierce, but there was a softness in them that spoke of compassion. "Thank you," Voin gasped, still trembling from the encounter. The woman nodded. "The spirits heard your call, but you must leave this place. The curse is stronger than you know." Voin nodded, his mind racing with questions, but there was no time for answers. The remaining werewolves were regrouping, their eyes fixed on the intruders. The woman handed Vuane a small pouch filled with more silver dust. "Go to the village and warn them," she said urgently. "Prepare for what's to come. We will hold them off as long as we can." Vuane took the pouch and turned to run, his legs barely able to carry him. He glanced back once, seeing the woman standing defiantly against the advancing pack. He felt a pang of guilt leaving her behind, but he knew he had no choice. The village needed him. As Vuane ran through the forest, he heard the sounds of battle behind him, the snarls and growls of the werewolves, the shouts of the woman, the clash of silver against fur. The sounds grew fainter as he neared the edge of the forest, but the fear in his heart did not diminish. He burst into the village just as the first light of dawn was breaking. The villagers, seeing his disheveled and blooded state, gathered around him, their faces filled with fear and concern. "We must prepare," Vuane panted. "The werewolves, they're coming." The villagers looked at each other, their fear palpable. They had heard the stories, but the reality of the threat was far more terrifying. They began to fortify the village, barricading doors and windows, gathering weapons and supplies. As night fell again, the village was on edge, every sound and shadow a potential threat. Vuane stood at the center of it all, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. The forest loomed dark and menacing, and he knew that the werewolves were out there, waiting for their chance to strike. The night was long and tense, every moment filled with dread. And then, just as the moon reached its zenith, the howls began. The villagers' faces turned pale as the eerie sound echoed through the village, a chilling reminder of the danger they faced. The werewolves attacked with a ferocity that none of the villagers had ever seen. They tore through the barricades, their strength and savagery overwhelming the meager defenses. Vuane fought valiantly, the silver dust and iron poker his only weapons, but it was not enough. One by one, the villagers fell, their screams piercing the night. Vuane fought on, driven by a desperate hope to save at least a few, but he was soon surrounded. The scarred werewolf, the leader of the pack, stood before him, its eyes glowing with a sinister intelligence. "This is the end," the werewolf growled, its voice a deep, menacing rumble. Vuane looked around, seeing the bodies of his friends and neighbors, the village he had sworn to protect lying in ruins. He felt a crushing despair, knowing he had failed. As the werewolf lunged, he closed his eyes, accepting his fate. The last thing Vuane heard was the triumphant howl of the werewolf, a sound that echoed through the empty streets of Belford, a haunting reminder of the terror that had befallen the village. And as the night gave way to dawn, the village lay silent and desolate, the werewolves having claimed their victory. The curse of the werewolves remained unbroken, a dark shadow that would continue to haunt the land for generations to come.